My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old, and I teach 7th grade math at Riverside Middle School. Last December, I sat at a dinner table surrounded by people I barely knew, wearing a dress I'd bought on sale, and my sister-in-law leaned across her chair, smiled at the most important man in the room, and said, "Oh, don't mind Claire. She's just a teacher at some public school downtown." A few people around the table smiled politely. One older woman even nodded like that explained everything. I didn't say a word. I just reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. But across the table, a man with silver hair and kind eyes stopped mid-conversation and looked directly at me. He tilted his head slightly, the way someone does when they're trying to place a face they haven't seen in a long time. He didn't say anything yet. He just kept looking. And something told me the evening was about to change entirely. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Heartstring Stories. And drop a comment below where you're watching from, and have you ever been made to feel small because of what you do for a living? I'd really love to know. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. My brother Ryan and I grew up in a small house in Columbus, Ohio. Our mom worked double shifts at a diner most of my childhood, and our dad drove a delivery truck until his back gave out when I was 16. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and we had a very clear understanding of what it meant to work hard for something. Ryan was always the ambitious one. He studied business, got an entry-level job at a financial firm straight out of college, worked 80-hour weeks for years, and eventually climbed his way up to a senior management position. I was proud of him. Genuinely proud. He had turned all that early struggle into something real. Then, he met Madison. Madison came from a completely different world. Her father owned a regional manufacturing company. Her mother sat on the board of 2 nonprofits and lunched at the kind of restaurants that don't post prices on the menu. Madison herself had gone to a private university, gotten a degree in communications, and now worked as a marketing director at a firm her father had personally introduced her to. She was polished, well-dressed, and very aware of how rooms looked when she walked into them. She wasn't unkind to me in the obvious ways. She never raised her voice or said anything cruel outright. It was more subtle than that. It was the way she described my job at dinner parties. "Claire teaches at one of those Title I schools," she'd say, like she was explaining a charity project. Or the way she'd look at my shoes when I arrived somewhere and then quickly look away. Or how she'd introduce me to her friends as Ryan's sister and then immediately pivot to a different conversation before anyone could ask me a question. Ryan noticed some of it. I know he did. But he loved her, and I understood that, so I never pushed it. I just kept showing up to family events, wearing my best outfits, smiling at her friends, and going home afterward to grade papers in my apartment. The December dinner was at Madison's parents' house in a suburb about 40 minutes outside the city. The Whitmore family hosted a holiday gathering every year, and this was the first time Ryan had brought me along. It was a big deal to him. He wanted me to see the side of his life he'd worked so hard to build. I told him I'd come. I bought a new dress, deep green. Simple, nothing flashy. I borrowed my neighbor's pearl earrings. I showed up on time and brought a bottle of wine that I'd spent 20 minutes choosing at the store. The house was enormous. White trim, tall windows, a wreath on the front door that probably cost more than my electric bill. Inside, it smelled like pine and candles, and a catering team moved quietly through the rooms with trays of food. About 30 people were already there when I arrived, gathered in small clusters, talking with the easy confidence of people who had been in rooms like that their whole lives. Madison found me almost immediately. She was wearing a deep red dress and had her hair pinned up the way you see in magazines. She looked beautiful, genuinely, and I told her so when she reached me. She accepted the compliment quickly, glanced at my dress for exactly 1 second, and then took my arm. "Come on," she said. "I want you to meet some people." She walked me around the room like a tour guide, introducing me to aunts and cousins and neighbors and her father's colleagues. I shook hands, said nice to meet you, laughed at the right moments. I was doing fine. I found a seat at one of the long tables set up in the main dining room and settled in next to an older woman named Patricia, who told me cheerful stories about her grandchildren and asked me genuine questions about my school. It was actually pleasant. Dinner was served around 7. The room filled with the sound of silverware and quiet conversation. Madison's father stood at the head of the table and gave a short toast about family and gratitude. Everyone raised their glasses. Ryan caught my eye from across the table and smiled at me, and I smiled back. That's when Madison stood up. She tapped her glass lightly with a spoon. The table quieted. "Before we start," she said warmly, "I just want to make sure everyone knows each other. We have some new faces this year." She looked around the table with the practiced ease of someone who loved having an audience. "Most of you know Ryan, my husband. And this," she turned and gestured toward me with an open hand, "is Claire, Ryan's little sister." I nodded and smiled politely. Madison kept going. "Claire is a teacher," she said. Then she paused just long enough to let the words settle. "Public school. Downtown." She tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they're describing something quaint. "God bless her for it, right? Someone has to do it." She laughed lightly, and a few people around the table chuckled, not meanly, just reflexively, the way people do when the host laughs. I kept my smile in place. I had learned a long time ago that reacting to things like that only made them worse and only made me look fragile. So, I nodded once and reached for my bread roll. From somewhere down the table, I heard someone say, "That's admirable," in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. And then the table moved on. Conversations resumed. Someone asked Madison about the holiday trip she and Ryan were planning. Someone else started talking about a restaurant that had just opened downtown. The moment passed, except it didn't pass for the man sitting diagonally across from me. I noticed him because he had stopped eating. He was older, probably mid-60s, with silver hair brushed neatly back and the kind of calm face that made you think he'd seen a lot of things in his life, and very few of them had surprised him. He was wearing a dark blazer and a simple tie, and until about 30 seconds ago he had been talking comfortably with the man beside him. But now he was quiet. He was looking at me. Not rudely. Not aggressively. It was the look of someone trying to solve a quiet puzzle. He was studying my face the way you study a painting you've seen before, but can't remember where. I glanced away and took a bite of my food. When I looked back up a few seconds later, he was still looking. Madison's father noticed his guest's distraction. "Gerald," he said, "you okay over there?" The man Gerald blinked once and nodded. Fine, he said. "Sorry. Just thinking." But his eyes drifted back to me almost immediately. The woman beside him leaned over and whispered something. He shook his head slightly, like he was clearing a thought, and picked up his fork again. But every minute or two, I caught him glancing back in my direction. Not staring, just checking, like a word he couldn't quite pronounce. Madison didn't seem to notice any of this. She was deep in a conversation about holiday travel, describing a villa in Tuscany with the focused enthusiasm she brought to most things that involved her own life. Ryan was listening to her, nodding, his hand resting on the table near hers. I turned back to Patricia, who was telling me about her granddaughter's soccer tournament, and I focused on that conversation instead. It was easier. It felt real. About 15 minutes later, during a lull while the second course was being cleared, Gerald spoke. He addressed me directly, his voice calm and unhurried. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Have we met before?" The table around us quieted slightly. A few people looked up. "I don't think so," I said carefully. "I'm not sure." He nodded, not dismissing the thought. "What did you say you teach?" "Math," I said. 7th grade. At Riverside Middle. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, but it shifted. He set his fork down slowly. "Riverside," he repeated quietly. Madison glanced over. "Gerald, she's just a teacher," she said with a small laugh, like she was rescuing him from an uninteresting conversation. "You two probably haven't crossed paths." But Gerald didn't seem to hear her. He was looking at me with the concentrated focus of someone trying to lift something heavy out of deep water. "How long have you been there?" he asked. "About 5 years," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you remember a student named Tyler Hartman?" The name landed somewhere in my chest before my brain had fully processed it. I looked at him more carefully now. "Tyler," I said slowly. "Tall kid. Quiet. Sat in the back row." Gerald exhaled. His hands, which had been resting flat on the table, slowly closed into loose fists. Not out of anger. Out of something much heavier than that. "That's my grandson," he said. The table went very still. I hadn't thought about Tyler Hartman in a while. Not because I'd forgotten him, but because the kids who need you the most are the ones you carry quietly for a long time after they leave your classroom. Tyler had been in my third period class about 4 years ago. He was 12, almost 13, and he was one of those students that other teachers had already given up on without saying so. His grades were failing. He never raised his hand. He ate lunch alone most days. His parents were in the middle of a divorce that had turned ugly, and the adults in his life were so busy managing their own pain that nobody had much left over for him. I noticed him early because of the way he sat. Not slumped the way bored kids sit, but curled slightly inward, like he was trying to take up less space than he already did. I started keeping him after class. Not to punish him, just to talk. About math at first, then about other things. He was actually sharp, genuinely smart in the quiet way that gets overlooked when a kid stops trying. I started staying an extra hour after school 3 days a week. I bought him a graphing calculator with my own money because I knew his family wasn't going to. I called him on Wednesday evenings sometimes, just to check in, because I knew Wednesdays were his hardest days the day he switched between his parents' houses. There was one Wednesday in February I still think about. He didn't pick up when I called. That was unusual. I tried again. Nothing. I called the school's emergency contact, which was listed as his grandfather. I told him I was worried, that Tyler hadn't responded, that he hadn't seemed okay in class that week. Gerald Hartman drove 40 minutes to his grandson's mother's house that night and found Tyler sitting alone in his room with the lights off, not responding to anyone. I didn't know what happened after that. I never asked. Tyler came back to school the following Monday, and slowly, over the next few months, something in him started to change. He started answering questions in class. He started eating lunch with a couple of other kids. By the end of the school year, he was passing. The year after that, in a different teacher's class, I heard he was doing well. And eventually, I stopped hearing about him at all, the way you do when kids start managing their own lives. I had not thought about that February Wednesday in a long time. Sitting at that dinner table in that beautiful house, with Madison's crystal glasses and catered food and polite conversation all around me, it felt very far away. Gerald Hartman looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Tyler is 20 now. He's a junior at Ohio State, studying civil engineering." I felt something warm move through my chest. "That's wonderful," I said. And I meant it completely. Gerald nodded slowly. His jaw was tight in the way people's jaws get when they're holding something in. "He talks about you," he said. "He has talked about you for 4 years. The table was completely quiet now. Even the conversations at the far end had faded. People were listening without pretending not to. "He told me about the phone calls," Gerald said. "He told me about the calculator. He told me about staying after school until almost 6 o'clock some nights just so he'd have somewhere to be." He paused. "He told me about the Wednesday you called me. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I didn't know your name," he continued. "Tyler just called you his math teacher. I tried to find out through the school who had reached out to me that night, but the front office couldn't tell me something about privacy policies. I stopped trying after a while. But Tyler never stopped talking about you." Ryan had put his fork down. He was looking at me the way older brothers look at you when they suddenly see something they missed. Gerald turned to the table. His voice was steady, but there was weight underneath it. "The night this woman called me," he said, "I found my grandson sitting alone in a dark room. He told me later he hadn't planned on being there the next morning." He let that sentence stand on its own for a moment. She didn't know that. She just knew something was wrong. And she picked up the phone because she was worried about a 12-year-old boy who wasn't her son, who wasn't her family, who wasn't her responsibility outside of a 40-minute class period. He looked back at me. And she did it on her own time. On a Wednesday evening. Because that's who she is. Someone at the far end of the table made a small sound. The older woman beside me, Patricia, reached over and briefly touched my hand. Madison had not moved. Her expression was difficult to read, somewhere between surprise and something that looked almost like embarrassment. She was very still. Gerald looked at her calmly. His voice didn't change. It stayed even, measured, the voice of a man who had learned to say difficult things without raising his volume. "You said she's just a teacher," he said. Madison opened her mouth slightly. "I know you didn't mean anything by it," he continued. "But I want to tell you what that phrase costs." He paused. "My grandson is alive and studying engineering at a university because this woman decided that a quiet, struggling 12-year-old boy was worth her Wednesday evenings. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because there was anything in it for her. Just because she saw him." He looked at Madison directly. "So no. She's not just a teacher. She's one of the most important people I have ever not been able to thank." The room was completely silent. Somewhere behind us, one of the caterers had paused in the doorway. Ryan stood up from his chair. He walked around the end of the table and came to where I was sitting, and he pulled me into a hug the way he used to when we were kids, tight and a little clumsy and completely genuine. "I didn't know," he said quietly, into my hair. "It was just my job," I said. He pulled back and looked at me. "No," he said. "It wasn't." Gerald stood up from his chair and walked around to my side of the table. He was taller than I'd realized. He extended his hand, and when I took it, he held it with both of his. "I have wanted to say thank you for 4 years," he said. "I didn't think I was going to get the chance." He smiled, and it was a tired and grateful smile. The kind that comes from carrying something for a long time and finally being able to set it down. "Tyler is going to want to know I found you." I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. A few guests began talking softly among themselves. Someone near the far end of the table started clapping quietly, and a few others joined. It was not the loud, performative applause of a party moment. It was the kind that happens when a room full of people has just been reminded of something they had temporarily forgotten. Patricia squeezed my hand again. "Good girl," she said softly. I looked down at the table for a moment. The bread roll I hadn't finished. My water glass. A small pine centerpiece with a candle flickering at the center of it. I was not the kind of person who needed a room to clap for me. I had never taught a single class with any expectation that someone was going to remember it a decade later. That was not why you did it. You did it because a kid sat in the back row and tried to disappear, and you decided that he didn't get to do that. Not on your watch. Not in your classroom. But I will not pretend it didn't matter. To sit in a room full of strangers who had just heard that your work meant something, that the hours you stayed late, and the phone calls you made, and the $20 calculator you bought out of your own grocery budget had actually landed somewhere real, I will not pretend that didn't. Fill something in me that I hadn't realized was empty. Madison did not speak for a long time after that. When she did, she addressed her plate more than the room. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," she said quietly. Nobody responded directly. The conversation around the table gently resumed, the way it does after something real has happened, and the room needs to breathe again. Ryan stayed in the seat beside me for the rest of the evening. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just kept refilling my water glass and passing me things and being present the way good older brothers are when they finally understood something they should have understood sooner. Gerald and I talked for almost an hour after dinner. He told me about Tyler's first year at college, how hard it was, how he'd called his grandfather every Sunday for the first semester. He told me Tyler had started volunteering as a math tutor at a community center near campus. I laughed when he told me that, and Gerald laughed too, and it was the easiest conversation I'd had all night. Before I left, he asked for my contact information. He said Tyler had been asking for years if there was any way to reach out to his old math teacher. I wrote my email address on the back of a receipt I found in my purse, which was not elegant, but it was what I had. Gerald folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his blazer like it was something worth keeping. On the drive home, I sat in the passenger seat of Ryan's car and watched the highway lights pass by outside the window. Ryan had the radio on low. Madison was in the back seat, quiet. After about 15 minutes, she said my name. I turned around. She was looking at her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said. "About what I said at dinner." I looked at her for a moment. She wasn't the villain of anything. She was just someone who had grown up in a world where certain kinds of work were invisible, and she had never thought carefully enough about why. That happened to people. It happened to most people at some point. "I know," I said. She nodded once, still looking at her hands. That was enough. I turned back to the window. 3 days later, I got an email. The subject line was blank. The body of it said, "Miss Henderson, my grandfather told me he finally found you. I've been wanting to say this for 4 years. Thank you for the Wednesday calls. Thank you for staying late. Thank you for the calculator. I still have it. I'm studying to be an engineer now. I thought you should know. Tyler." I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on my kitchen counter and stood there for a minute in the quiet of my apartment, in my sweater and socks, next to a stack of ungraded quizzes and an empty coffee mug. Then I sat down and wrote back. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that doesn't make noise. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need an audience or a room full of applause or a toast at a holiday dinner. It lives in small things: a folded receipt in a blazer pocket, a subject line left blank, a calculator that a kid kept for 4 years. It lives in the quiet work of people who show up anyway, not because anyone is watching, but because there's a child in a dark room on a Wednesday night, and someone has to pick up the phone. I went back to school the following Monday. Third period. 23 seventh graders in plastic chairs. Textbooks open to chapter 9. I stood at the front of the room and looked at them, the bored ones, the eager ones, the quiet ones in the back rows, and I thought about Tyler Hartman, who had once been one of the quiet ones. Then I picked up the dry erase marker and started teaching. Because that was my job. And my job was never just anything.